What's good? What's good? I am going to do some more reading from Varieties of Psychohistory by Kren and Rappaport. Just miscellaneous, perspective, thought, thinking words. This chapter is titled Violence Without Moral Restraint: Reflections on the Dehumanization of Victims and Victimizers. The problem of violence. My interest in the problem of violence is an interest in the study of war and peace, of nationalism and militarism, of nonviolent approaches to social change and conflict resolution. But within the broader context of the questions raised by the Nazi Holocaust, aimed at the systemic destruction of the Jewish people, have confronted me most profoundly and persistently. They have special meaning for me because, as a Jew brought up in Vienna who managed to get out of Nazi Austria a year after the Anschluss, and then to get out of Belgium a few weeks before the Nazi invasion, and who lost countless relatives and childhood friends to the gas chambers and the execution squads. I am only a step removed from the category of Holocaust survivor, although I would not presume to arrogate to myself the authority of true survivors, those who survived the Holocaust in death camps or in hiding within Nazi territory. The attempts at genocide, of which the Holocaust is the most extreme and grotesque, but by no means the only recent manifestation, represent a profound challenge to our thinking about human nature and human society, from both a moral and socio-psychological point of view. Indeed, I would argue, it is the most profound challenge of our century, but one with which we have barely begun to grapple. Explanations that remain entirely at the psychological level of analysis, or invoke a single overarching psychological principle, are less than helpful. Social, psychological, or psychohistorical perspectives, however, as several diverse writings have demonstrated, can contribute some of the pieces to what is necessarily a multifaceted quest for understanding, and can throw some light on the question of how such things are possible. I see my own reflections as a modest and incomplete contribution to such an effort. I do not pretend that I have any answers. All I hope is to develop some of the terms within which questions can be formulated. Characteristics of sanctioned massacres. My focus is on a class of violent acts that can be described as sanctioned massacres. I am speaking of indiscriminate, ruthless, and often systematic mass violence carried out by military or paramilitary personnel while engaged in officially sanctioned campaigns and directed at defenseless and unresisting civilians, including old men, women, and children. Though occurring in the course of officially sanctioned activities, the massacres themselves may or may not be specifically sanctioned. The larger context is usually, though not necessarily, an international or civil war, a revolutionary or secessionist struggle, a colonial or ethnic conflict, a change or consolidation of political power. The Nazi atrocities against the Jews and the U.S. atrocities against the Indo-Chinese people are prime examples of the kind of mass violence I have in mind, but numerous other cases would clearly fit that description. Within American history, My Lai had its precursors in the Philippine War around the turn of the century. not to speak of the Indian massacres. Elsewhere in the world, one recalls the massacres and deportations of Armenians, the liquidation of the kulaks, and the great purges in the Soviet Union, and more recently, the massacres in Indonesia and Bangladesh, in Biafra and Burundi, in South Africa and Mozambique. It should also be pointed out that the different examples of violence that clearly fall within my definition are by no means entirely equivalent to one another. They may vary on a number of important dimensions. For example, the context of counterinsurgency warfare waged by a high-technology society against low-technology societies, as in the case of U.S. actions in Indochina, provides a unique set of atrocity-producing conditions. In contrast to those in which there are no differences in level of technology, or in which such differences are less marked. Another important distinction is between massacres that are part of a deliberate policy aiming to exterminate a category of people, and those that are inevitable byproducts of a policy which is not aimed at extermination, but which contemplates and plans the destruction of vast population groups as a means toward other ends, such as counterinsurgency or consolidation of power. Probably the most extreme example of the former type of situation is the Nazis' final solution. For European Jewry, in which a policy aimed at exterminating millions of people was consciously articulated and executed, in which such extermination was an end in itself, and in which the extermination was accomplished on a mass production basis through the literal establishment of a well-organized, efficient death industry. United States policies in Indochina exemplify the second type of situation, though I feel that there is overwhelming evidence that the United States has committed monstrous war crimes and crimes against humanity in Indochina in pursuit of a policy that considered the Vietnamese population entirely expendable. The evidence does not suggest that the extermination has been the conscious purpose of the policy. These various differences may have important moral as well as socio-psychological implications. For present purposes, however, I do not intend to dwell on such differences, but to discuss at a much more general level the common features shared by the entire class of sanctioned massacres. The question for the social psychologist is, what are the conditions under which normal people become capable of planning, ordering, committing, or condoning acts of mass violence of this kind? Before attempting to answer this question, we must examine the special characteristics of this class of violent acts as compared to other kinds of violence, particularly other kinds of organized violence, recognizing throughout that there are continuities between the different forms of organized violence and that no sharp line can be drawn between them. Two special features characterize this class of violence, relating to its context and its target. The context of violence. The sanctioned massacres that we are dealing with here occur in the context of an overall policy that is genocidal in character, in the sense that it is designed to destroy all or part of a category of people defined in ethnic, national, racial, religious, or other terms. In line with the distinctions that I have already drawn, such a policy may be deliberately aimed at the systematic extermination of a population group as an end in itself, as was the case with the Nazi destruction of European Jewry. Alternatively, the policy may be aimed at an objective other than extermination, such as the pacification of the rural population of South Vietnam, as is the case of U.S. policy in Indochina, but may include the deliberate decimation of large segments of a population as an acceptable means to that end. I am not qualified to judge whether U.S. actions in Vietnam constitute genocide in the legal terms of the UN Convention on Genocide, but they can be said to have at least genocidal dimension. Central to U.S. strategy in South Vietnam were such actions as unrestricted air and artillery bombardments of peasant hamlets, search and destroy missions by ground troops, crop denial programs, and mass deportation of rural populations. These actions, and similar actions in Laos and Cambodia, have been clearly and deliberately aimed at civilian populations and have resulted in the death, injury, and uprooting of large numbers of that population, and in the destruction of their countryside, their source of livelihood, and their social structure. These consequences have been known to the policymakers, and indeed intended as a part of their pacification effort. The actions were designed to clear the countryside in order to bring the rural population under control and to deprive the guerrillas of their base of operation. Thus, while extermination of the civilian population was not the end of the policy, the physical destruction of large numbers of the population and the destruction of their way of life were regarded as acceptable means. Massacres of the kind that occurred in My Lai were not deliberately planned, but they took place in an atmosphere that made it quite clear that the civilian population was expendable, and that actions resulting in the indiscriminate killing of civilians were central to the strategy of war. The target of violence. A second feature of the class of violence under discussion is that it is directed at groups that have not themselves threatened or engaged in hostile actions towards the perpetrators of the violence. Usually, the targets of massacres belong to groups that are physically weaker than their victimizers. Although massacres are often directed at minorities that may be economically more advanced than the masses of the population within which they live. By definition, the victims of this class of violence are defenseless civilians, including old men, women, and children. There are, of course, historical and situational reasons why a particular group becomes a suitable target for massacres. In this sense, it can perhaps be said that the victims provoke the violence by what they are. It cannot, however, be said in any objectively meaningful sense that they provoke the violence against them by what they have done. They are not being murdered because they have harmed, oppressed, or threatened their attackers. Rather, their selection as targets for massacre at a particular time can ultimately be traced to their relationship of the pursuit of larger policies. They may be targeted because their elimination is seen as a useful tool or because their continued existence is seen as an irritating obstacle in the execution of policy. The genocidal context of this class of violence and the fact that it is directed at a target that did not provoke the violence through its own actions has some definite implications for the psychological environment within which sanctioned massacres occur. It is an environment that seems almost totally devoid of those conditions that people usually see as providing at least some degree of moral justification for violence. Neither the reason for the violence nor its purpose is of the kind that people would normally consider justifiable. The most widely accepted justification for violence is that it occurred for reasons of self-defense against attack or the threat of attack. When this reason is extended to the international level, it may refer not only to the threats to the physical existence of a nation, but also to threats to its basic values or its vital national interests. Similarly, violence, both at the interpersonal and at the intergroup level, is often seen as morally justified when it occurs in response to oppression or other forms of strong provocation. There is even a tradition that justifies violence in the face of symbolic harm, as evidenced by leniency toward the perpetrators of crimes of passion. In all these cases, the violence is provoked by actions that cause harm or threaten harm to the perpetrator of the violence, and it is directed at the source of this provocation. Violence under these conditions, particularly organized violence in the form of warfare, is not seen as morally acceptable by everyone and at all times. People may disagree in principle about the precise point at which they would draw the line between justifiable and unjustifiable reasons for violence. In any given case, they may disagree about the justification for violence because of differences in their assessment of the nature of the provocation and the probable consequences of the response. Nevertheless, most people would agree that violence in self-defense or in response to oppression and other forms of strong provocation is at least within the realm of moral discourse, even those who consider violence unjustifiable under such conditions, in general or in any given case, would acknowledge that there is room for legitimate disagreement among moral people on this score. By contrast, violence of the kind that I have described as sanctioned massacres is entirely outside of the realm of moral discourse, in that it does not occur in response to those conditions that are normally accepted as partial or complete justification for violence. Moral justification for violence depends not only on its reasons, but also on its purposes. Again, self-defense presents the purest case. If a violent response clearly blocks an act of aggression, if by taking the life of an attacker you save your own life or the lives of other potential victims, then most people would regard it as morally justifiable. As one moves away from this rather clearest case, particularly into the area of organized violence, the issues become much more complicated and moral consensus more difficult to attain. Nevertheless, moral justification for violence usually depends on the extent to which it is seen as serving a defensive purpose, even though that term may be given a rather broad definition. Thus, the use of violence by police or troops in the control of riots or the suppression of rebellions is often considered justified, even though it may lead to the killing of some innocent bystanders, but only to the extent to which it is necessary to contain the rioters or rebels. Indiscriminate or purely punitive violence would generally be considered unacceptable in this case. In the case of warfare, these considerations are written into international law. Although the rules of warfare are quite permissive, even with regard to the killing of civilians, they do impose some definite limits. The degree and kind of violence used must be justified by considerations of military necessity, i.e., as steps required for the purpose of defeating the enemy. And the targeting of civilian populations is prohibited outright. In short, the moral justification for violence depends on the extent to which it is related to the purpose of stopping aggression or neutralizing a threat towards one's self or his group. Once again, sanctioned massacres, which are designed to destroy entire segments of a population, occur in the absence of a condition that is normally considered to provide some degree of moral justification for violence. Oh man, thank you so much if you've listened, because this is very thought-provoking stuff for me. It really puts things into context, especially during times like this. Much love, power to the people. I believe in you. Stay woke.